Elizabeth isn't allowed to be like 1883's Elsa, and 1923 is lesser for it. Elizabeth Strafford, Michelle Randolph, makes a comment in 1923 Season 2, Episode 6 that shows the innate differences between her and a Dutton ancestor, Elsa Dutton Isabel May, who was from a similar walk of life, but probably would have felt differently about Lizzie's predicament. As Elizabeth and Cara Dutton, Helen Mirren, sit and wait for a war to break out, Elizabeth remarks that there are men on their front porch to prevent others from taking the ranch. While they may join the fight, the housebound female 1923 characters feel quite vulnerable at the moment. Despite her perseverance through all the horrible things that have happened to Elizabeth Strafford in 1923, we have yet to see her fight for her life and the Yellowstone Dutton Ranch. This contrasts with Jack Dutton's, Darren Mann, aunt, Elsa, who features in the 1883 prequel and fights her way through the story. Elsa probably would have fought for the ranch on the front lines too, had she survived 1883. We see the same grit from other Yellowstone characters, but unfortunately, not Elizabeth, and it's been a defining element of her 1923 Season 2 story. Elizabeth's frustration in 1923 Season 2, Episode 6, is understandable. However, it highlights why she has struggled to live at the Yellowstone Dutton Ranch. Elizabeth remarks that it's the 20th century and there are cars, airplanes, and movie theaters, yet people are battling for the land they occupy. While it's understandable that Elizabeth is frustrated in the mountain teeth of monsters, baffled by the need for such hostility, her remarks in the chapter paint how truly Nave Strafford is about the survivalist nature of life on the ranch, which she has struggled to mesh with. While she was raised partially on the Strafford Ranch adjacent to the Yellowstone, Elizabeth spent her winters in Boston, so she didn't develop the same grit as the rest of the Dutton family tree. Michelle Randolph's character isn't meant to be like Elsa. She isn't a gunslinger, and she isn't in love with the American West, and that's okay. Still, Elizabeth's tendency to be deeply out of touch with how life-threatening her circumstances are continuously puts her in danger. Elizabeth's comments, indicating her lack of perspective, reflect Paul's, August Prue, and Hillary's, Janet Montgomery, naivety leading to their death. Elsa comes to mind when I consider how unprepared Elizabeth is for the Dutton family's war, because she came from a similar set of circumstances and yet acted differently. James Dutton's, Tim McGraw, daughter had never experienced the American West. She too had a romanticized idea of what life in the West would be like, as does Elizabeth, proving they have a fair amount in common. Elizabeth and Elsa are both from the East, and yet Elsa rises to the challenge of surviving in the West in a way that Elizabeth has barely scratched the surface of. 1923 screenwriter Taylor Sheridan included an ominous soliloquy at the end of Episode 6, decrying that humans can't outsmart nature, and we're all just battling for our survival. His characters who embrace this mentality in the Yellowstone franchise shine, and Elizabeth's being out of touch makes her story less satisfying. After Elsa's 1883 death, the harsh reality is that Elizabeth doesn't step up and replace her legacy. However, other characters do. 1923 characters like Cara and Tana Rainwater, Amina Neves, are some of the franchise's most valiant, and Alexandra Dutton, Julia Schlapfer, has proved she, too, is lion-hearted. When 1883 introduced Elsa Dutton, audiences met a protagonist unlike any other in Yellowstone's sprawling universe. Elsa was fiery, headstrong, and unapologetically wild. A young woman who defied societal norms and carved her own path in a brutal, unforgiving world. Her narrative was rich with autonomy, passion, and tragedy, elements that made her an unforgettable force within the Dutton legacy. However, when 1923 rolled around, Elizabeth Strafford, the young woman poised to become the next great Dutton matriarch, was not afforded the same complexity or depth. Instead of following in Elsa's free-spirited footsteps, Elizabeth was restrained, domesticated, and ultimately overshadowed by the weight of the show's grander conflicts. It's a shame, really. The Yellowstone prequels have thrived on crafting powerful women who hold their own amidst the rugged landscape of the American West. Elsa was a character who represented the untamed heart of the frontier, a young woman who embodied the contradictions of strength and vulnerability. She wasn't merely a love interest or an accessory to the men in her life. She was the story. She fell in love, she fought, she rode harder than most men, and she narrated her own tragic destiny. Elizabeth, by contrast, is shackled to a more traditional role. She begins as a promising character, engaged to Jack Dutton and seemingly ready to embrace the unpredictable life of ranching. But 1923 quickly reduces her to a supporting role, primarily defined by her relationship with Jack and her struggles to conform to life on the Dutton Ranch. Unlike Elsa, Elizabeth isn't given the freedom to be wild or untamed. She doesn't have her own journey beyond the constraints of marriage and domesticity. It's not that Elizabeth needed to be a carbon copy of Elsa. But when you compare their arcs, it's hard not to feel like 1923 took a step backward in how it portrayed its young female lead. Elsa's romance with Sam was a bold, sweeping love story built on mutual respect and adventure. She took risks both emotionally and physically. She challenged her father's worldview and, in many ways, was his equal in navigating the harsh realities of the West. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is largely reactive. Her role is to support Jack, to mourn losses, to endure hardships. While those are certainly realistic struggles for a woman of her time, it's frustrating to see her confined to them without much agency of her own. Unlike Elsa, who actively shaped her own destiny, Elizabeth feels like she's being pulled along by forces greater than herself. Perhaps the biggest disappointment is that 1923 had the opportunity to explore a different kind of female resilience through Elizabeth. The show could have leaned into the difficulties of being a young woman adjusting to ranch life without making her merely a background figure in Jack's story. Imagine an arc where she grappled with whether or not she truly wanted to be part of the Dutton legacy, rather than just blindly accepting it because of her love for Jack. Imagine a version of Elizabeth who had to prove herself, not just to the ranch hands, but to herself through her own trials and triumphs. Elsa's tragedy was that her spirit was too free for the world she lived in. She wasn't meant to be confined to the walls of a ranch house, and ultimately, she died as wildly as she lived. Elizabeth's tragedy, in contrast, is that she's never given the chance to be anything other than a dutiful wife-in-waiting. 1923 is a compelling show in many ways, rich with sweeping drama and intricate character dynamics. But in sidelining Elizabeth and denying her the same fire that made Elsa so captivating, it loses an opportunity to tell a truly great story about the women of the Dutton family. It's a reminder that not all characters are allowed to break free from traditional molds, and that in itself is a loss for the show and its legacy.